Good morning, everyone. My name is Natalie Gochnour. I direct the Kem C Gardner Policy Institute and want to welcome you to the Thomas S. Monson Center. This mansion serves as a central gathering place for thought leadership in our community. Today, we are very excited to share news about a critical issue facing our state, the historically low water levels of Great Salt Lake. These low water levels threaten economic activity, local public health, and ecosystems, and the situation requires urgent action. Today, we are releasing results of the work by the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, a collaboration of experts in public policy, hydrology, water management, climatology, and dust from the University of Utah, Utah State University, and state agencies. The strike team, which was convened by Presidents Taylor Randall and Noel Cockett, provides impartial, data-informed, and solution-oriented support for Utah decision makers. The strike team does not advocate, but rather functions in a technical, policy advisory role as a service to the state. Could the members of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team here today please stand up and be recognized? Thank you so much. I'd also like to acknowledge the team of professionals here at the Gardner Institute for their great work. Eric Albers, Paul Springer, Nick Thuriot, Jennifer Robinson, and adopted our USU partner, Anna McIntyre. Would you stand real briefly? I also want to acknowledge the named donor of the Kem C Gardner Policy Institute who joins us here today. Kem, do you mind just being acknowledged? He asked us to work on this like a year ago, and we finally got it done. Finally, I want to just take a personal moment and acknowledge Kelly Hanna, who is here with us today. This document that we'll share with you as you leave today includes stunning images of Great Salt Lake that illustrate what a beautiful and precious resource this is for our state. Kelly's photographs of Great Salt Lake are currently on display in the Utah State Capitol. They are breathtaking. Kelly graciously offered his photos for this assessment. We've made a lot of use of them, and we want to make special note of his beautiful work. Kelly, will you please stand and be recognized? I'd now like to invite Bill Anderegg, the director of the Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy at the University of Utah, to provide a high-level overview of the data and science. And I'm just going to slip to the slide, and Bill, let you take over right here.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Brian Steed and I are going to present the core findings of this strike team report. But first, I want to thank again the co-chairs of this effort and all of the strike team members. This has been an incredible and an incredibly productive partnership and collaboration between our research universities and state agencies to serve our great state. So thank you all. When I think about this report, we really set out to answer two fundamental and fairly broad questions. How did we get here? And what can we do now? I'm going to tell you first about some of the science behind how did we get here and a little bit of what might the future hold for water availability in the Great Salt Lake Basin. The fundamental story here is no surprise to all of us that over the last century or so, the Great Salt Lake, the lake levels have oscillated somewhat around this long-term average of about 4,200 feet. 4199 is the 120-year average. If we zoom in on this contemporary period, after a record high in the mid-80s, we've seen this long downward trend of declining lake levels until last year we hit a record low. This is the annual number of just around 4190, but of course the monthly and daily numbers are even below that, sort of 4189. This is incredibly concerning, and the lake is in a dire state. Let's look at the hydrological drivers. So the very first question is, how much water is coming into the system? We can look at the precipitation coming into the basins that feed the Great Salt Lake, and this is showing you that precipitation over the past 120 years. I want to particularly focus again on this contemporary period of 1980 to present. Despite multiple dry years and some very severe droughts, it's fairly striking that there's actually no long-term trend in precipitation, that there's no trend over the 120-year record or the past 40 years. This tells us that, on average, it's not that there's much less water entering the basin, it's something else that's happening after that. So let's then zoom in on water coming to the lake. This is showing you the Bear River inflow to the Great Salt Lake, and keep in mind that the Bear River is the largest input. It's about 50% of the water coming in. And again, looking at this contemporary period, here we actually do see declines of water coming into the lake over this window. And that tells us that it's really water consumption upstream, both natural and predominantly human consumption, that's driving this long-term lake level. So there are more minor components of precipitation variability in dry years and a warming climate that evaporates more water, but the long-term driver, really, the key driver is human water use. Just a very quick picture of what are these water uses. This shows you, zooming in a little bit more to where we have consistent data from the 90s to present, of the main water uses in these basins. The overall water use here is in black. You can see agriculture is the largest water user there in green, and there's significant contributions from other water uses. You can see municipal and industrial in red, and mineral extraction in yellow, and several other terms. There are some increasing water uses on the lake, and so mineral extraction is one of those. You can see two of the mineral extraction water users have increased their water use since the 1990s. So this data about what water is coming into the watershed and what water is making it to the lake is really crucial in informing and shaping our policy options. What do we have? What tools do we have to address the situation? The final piece that I want to tell you about is what might the future look like and what can we expect for water availability in the lake. And here the strike team synthesized a number of cutting-edge computer models that are simulating the future temperatures, precipitation, and evaporation in this region. Temperatures, this is in a high climate warming scenario. Temperatures are projected to go up. That's this upper right red graph. But I want to really focus on these leftmost two graphs. The top one in green is precipitation. Big picture here, precipitation, there's a lot of variability, a lot of year-to-year fluctuation, and there's a lot of differences across these different computer models. But on average, we expect a slight increase in precipitation over time. That's the good news. The bad news is that because a warmer air sucks more water out of soils, out of plants, and out of reservoirs and rivers, we also expect a higher evaporation loss in the system. And if you just focus on these long-term averages, they roughly cancel each other out, or the evaporation losses are even slightly higher than the average precipitation increases. This tells us that really in coming decades, we should expect similar or even slightly less water available coming into the system on net, and we need to plan for this and be ahead of the curve here. So now the question is, how much water do we need? And I will turn this over then to Brian.
And to be clear, I'm applauding for Bill and not for the lead-in to the where do we need to be. Before getting into the substance, I also want to say thank you to all those who participated in this process. It has been a very robust process. It's taken a lot of time, mostly by volunteers that care a lot about the issue. And so it's been, I've worked in natural resources for a long time. It's been perhaps the most rewarding experience in that sense of collaboration that we've had. I also wanted to thank our hosts here, the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute, and the man himself. So thank you so much for having us and for helping facilitate this. Let's talk target range elevations. before we get into this, a couple caveats. We as a strike team are policy agnostic, which means that we are presenting options, and this is a bit of a choose your own adventure when it comes to what those ranges ought to be. In truth, there are any number of ranges where the lake could be from where we are right now. We have detailed in the report a variety of scenarios where we see how fast you could refill the lake to certain levels. I'd encourage you all to review the report to see that, but ultimately, how fast we refill the lake to certain levels is going to require, so if you do it more quickly, it will require more water in the short term. If it takes longer term, then there is a longer term policy commitment to getting that conserved water to the lake. And again, it really is a choose your own adventure. Why we ended up listing those lake levels, it's based on a bit of analysis done by the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, where they went and they reviewed kind of the benefits of different lake levels, both for the human population as well as ecosystem functionality. And what they found is, in that analysis, is that there are different ranges for which we see different consequences on the lake. Currently, we are in what is identified as serious adverse effects, which means we're seeing concerns over salinity, as salinity has risen to the point where we're not seeing the same production of either brine shrimp or brine flies that we'd like to see, as well as just seeing some overall concerns on the health of the lake. As you increase that lake level, salinity goes, the salinity actually, as the lake level rises, salinity decreases, and as a result of that, more water is generally better for salinity. In addition to that, we have a lot of human concerns. I think that we've all heard about dust concerns coming off of the exposed lake bed. Again, a lower lake, you have more exposed playa. That more exposed playa, as it weathers over time, you'll have more dust events going forward. And so really, you look at those different levels. So the next level up would be adverse effects, where there are certain impacts to brine shrimp viability, recreation, ecosystem health, but it's not as bad as we are right now. And then really at 4195, we really see where it gets into the transitionary zone, where there are some adverse effects, certainly from dust, but it's not as significant as we're facing now. When the lake reaches 4198, you see that you're in a optimal range where you have the best ecosystem health as well as the best outcomes for human population around it. So again, that is a choose your own adventure for policymakers on what to do. We think that setting a lake level is important because it's a target range and it's something that the state can work towards on getting that level, but ultimately that will be policymakers who decide what lake level that is. In looking at the policy options to get there, there has been a lot of conversation, and it's been grim about, well, all is lost, and we would take a very differing view to that. I think that we absolutely can make a difference on our choices going forward, and those differences can make a real impact. We identified 11 different options. They really fall in 3 tranches. One is conservation, another is finding new water, and the third is working with engineering solutions on the existing lake to manage the lake as a more managed ecosystem. Let's talk about some of these as we go forward. Before we get into that, just a reminder. And I have worked my career in public policy. And oftentimes we talk about things as if there's great panaceas. And I'd like to make us all aware that there are no panaceas to this problem. We're not going to solve the problem through one approach, but it's going to take a variety of approaches. In addition to that, just be aware that all of these policy options involve trade-offs. And those trade-offs are going to be something that we, as a society, are going to have to evaluate on how we go forward. Similarly to that, it's going to take a combination of factors. There's not a silver bullet. And so just be aware of that. And also be aware that this is a very complicated system. And that very complicated system is going to take something of adaptive management. We're going to have to try different things and evaluate how we're doing. And last but not least, one of the things that I find most satisfactory about this process is that the Great Salt Lake does not exist as a singular water problem in the Western United States, but instead it can be used as an example of how different choices can affect different outcomes, and ultimately the lessons from the Great Salt Lake, I think, can be applied to all different bodies of water in the state of Utah, as well as in the Intermountain West, I would argue in the Western United States as well. So just be aware of that. The policy options that we'll talk about, well, I'm going to go through just generally where we went through the 11. We had a scorecard to where we wanted to evaluate on similar playing grounds how these policy options go. So, for instance, commit conserved water to Great Salt Lake, and you see there's benefits, costs, and challenges and adaptations, feasibility, agricultural water optimization, optimize municipal and industrial water pricing, limiting municipal and industrial water use and growth, water banking and leasing, active forest management in Great Salt Lake headwaters, Great Salt Lake mineral extraction optimization, importing water, which is more on that new water side, as well as increasing precipitation with cloud seeding, also on that new water side. And then on the engineering approaches, you could have raising and lowering the causeway berm, as well as mitigating dust emission hotspots. I'd like to highlight a few of these. We really have focused a lot on the conservation side because as you evaluate these, they're some of the lowest cost and highest benefit options. And I'll go with committing conserved water to the Great Salt Lake first. What this means is this: we have all invested a lot in conservation over the last few years. I think that the state legislature has certainly put a fair amount of money towards this, as well as we've had a lot of conversations at high levels of government. The issue is if we conserve water and we don't commit that to the Great Salt Lake, then really it may not benefit the Great Salt Lake directly. There's lots of benefits from conservation, but it may not directly benefit the Great Salt Lake. So looking at some sources of water that we could certainly dedicate to the Great Salt Lake, wastewater effluent within the GSL watershed, lots of water available there that we could commit and then shepherd down and commit it to the Great Salt Lake. Similarly, wastewater effluent directly into the Great Salt Lake. And then we'll talk about one of these other options, agricultural water optimization, where we're helping farmers and ranchers commit to more efficient practices and potentially being able to help them utilize those water savings, sell them for the benefit of shepherding again into the Great Salt Lake. And then last year we invested pretty heavily in secondary water metering as a state, committing the conserved, or at least a portion of the conserved water from that secondary water metering to the Great Salt Lake. Next, we have a bit of a video prepared by two of the task force members, Sarah Knoll and Beth Nielsen, talk about how this shepherding process works and why it matters.
As we're trying to get water to the Great Salt Lake, we're asking people to conserve, and we're asking people to change their behavior. If we're asking them to sacrifice, we want to ensure that water actually gets switched to the Great Salt Lake and results in the kinds of progress that we are all hoping to make. Water shepherding is committing conserved or purchased water to Great Salt Lake. Without that, other people or other water demands can intercept that water. So right now we have lots of conservation programs in the state to free up water, and then that water could just go to a different user. And that might not be what they intended. So this water shepherding piece is a way to actually commit that water to Great Salt Lake.
So again, seeking to dedicate the water that we save through conservation into a dedicated flow into the Great Salt Lake is something that we evaluated. Another is limiting municipal and industrial water growth. We know that we are facing tremendous growth pressures as a state. How we grow matters, and we have evaluated the possibility of approaching water neutral growth, which means two things. One, on new growth, that we would implement as high a possible efficiency, so you increase depletions from M&I growth by having high efficiency development, so maybe limiting the amount of outdoor watering that new development has, maybe limiting the type of water used indoors on all new development. And then the second piece of that is to approach existing residences as well as industrial uses and retrofit whatever they're doing with systems that reduce depletions. So think of a turf buyback program or water efficiency programs within outdoor watering. Great Salt Lake, the city of Salt Lake had a program to change out seed blends that have a more efficient water use on that seed blend. So those types of things to make sure that people use less water. Doing both those things, we actually decrease pressures to find new water, and instead can live within the water that we're already using, it's evaluated. Next, agricultural water optimization. Agriculture, as it was noted, was the first historical development of water in the state and has remained in operation since then. One of our task force members, Matt Yost, has done extensive work on water optimization within that by adopting different technologies. You can optimize different farming programs and have a savings of at least or as much as 15% of water savings. You think about that over the amount of water rights that are in the Great Salt Lake watershed, that could be quite extensive in terms of the number of acre feet that we could conserve. As we increase that kind of percentage, if we're looking for more percentages out of agriculture, it really is difficult to optimize our way out of that, and so that you may end up going into more of a deficit or fallow programs. And so this graph shows how that works. And if we were to proceed down this pathway, again, this would have to be a voluntary program involving compensation for farmers and ranchers to make sure that they get their due share based on the water rights they currently have. Next, water banking and leasing, also on the conservation side. If you think about this, again, if we optimize water on an agricultural setting and there's a 15% water savings, that farmer or rancher has two choices. They could invest that 15% into new growth, or a second option might be, what if we had a third party come in and say, hey, we'll pay you for that 15% savings to keep that in stream? Or similarly, we could pay that farmer or rancher to fallow for a year. We have existing programs that are kind of getting up and going in the state. We additionally, last year, invested $40 million in a Great Salt Lake Water Trust. So water banking is something that we could certainly do. And what that does is you lease that water from those individuals and guarantee that that water is shepherded down through the system, as we discussed before, and making it into the Great Salt Lake. And those are just three. We have more discussion, but really, again, thank you so much for your willingness to come out and pay attention to this important issue. And thanks again to Natalie, our host.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And just a reminder, Brian serves as the Executive Director of the Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air. And it gives me the opportunity now to introduce some of our other panelists. David Tarbotten joins us. David is the Director of the Utah Water Research Laboratory at Utah State University. Paul Brooks joins us, a Professor of Geology and Geophysics at the University of Utah. We have Joel Ferry, the Executive Director of the Utah Department of Natural Resources, and Candace Hazenyaker. Gochnour, how do Gochnour say Hazenyaker? Hasenjager. Candace is here, a good friend of mine, but I always know Candace, joins us, who directs the Division of Water Resources. And because I just acknowledged both the Executive Director of DNR and the Division Director of Water Resources, I would love all of the state agency professionals who have helped with the strike team, may have been on the strike team, may not have, but have helped us pull together these numbers, to just stand and be recognized. Come on, you guys are in the shadows. Joel, we're going to begin with you. You were a legislator last session when so many good things happened for the lake. Now you lead the Department of Natural Resources. Thank you for your service. I'd love you to just tie together what happened last session with the work of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team in terms of how do they tie together?
So last year we made huge strides in moving the ball forward. We were able to show how Great Salt Lake is having an impact on all of us, and we were able to accomplish some incredible tasks legislatively, both in policy and in funding. And what we were able to show was how this impacts every Utahn. A lot of the things that we did weren't easy, they were big lifts. We passed legislation regarding things like in-stream flows, which is the mechanism we talk about shepherding. That's the mechanism to get that water, the conserved water, down to the lake. We put significant funding into conservation programs, metering, ag optimization. We created a Great Salt Lake Trust. We did all of these really big lifts that personally I thought were going to take years and years and years, one step at a time, kind of build on it. 2 years ago, we created the water banking program and split season leasing. All of these are really important tools. I thought it was going to take years to get there. We kind of had a culmination. It was myself, Representative Hawks, Speaker Wilson, senators, representatives, all coming together to address this important issue. And we heard the voice of the people. The people kind of said, this is important to us. And it was this grassroots effort. It was incredible. It was really neat to be part of that. And it continues today. And it really led to this concept of the strike team, because some of the questions that were being asked, we had kind of a baseline, a fundamental understanding of this is what needs to be done, but we needed the science, we needed the detail. So the strike team really helped pull that together and has been extremely beneficial. Now that I've taken on this new role, as I've gone to the executive branch, every day it's discussions about water, Great Salt Lake, in addition to the other things we're working on. But I can tell you the team that we have at DNR, at Water Resources, Water Rights, our sovereign lands, so forestry, fire, and state lands, UGS and these other agencies are all working collaboratively together with our universities, our research universities, to come up with the best outcomes for the state.
Great.
We have good things in place, and now it's time to get to work.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that sort of table setting. Paul, we appear to be in a very wet year.
Yeah, isn't it awesome?
It's awesome. The lake apparently has already gone up a foot. And I just want to ask, why can't we just count on the wet years to get us out of this problem? And how do we capitalize on them?
So that's a great question. So it's looking like it's a really good year right now. We're already above what would be our average. And so that presents, from our viewpoint, from the strike team, an opportunity to get more water to the lake, to capitalize on these wet years. But what we've seen, if we look back in the historical record of the lake, both our observations and then further back with paleo records, we can expect a wet year, maybe a wet year or two every 12 or 13 years. If we go back in time, those of us who recreate in the mountains remember 2011, right? Oh, and then 1998. And then, of course, the big years of the 80s. So we see these peaks in precip that come around every 12 or 13 years. But they haven't prevented the decline of the lake. Those dry periods are actually getting drier and harder to manage. And by capitalizing on the wet periods, by conserving in a wet year, which might seem counterintuitive, we can get more water to the lake faster. And I think back to the target elevations and the amount of conservation. The choice is, if we get more water to the lake in a wet year, we don't have those higher conservation targets for as long. We get to the lower conservation targets of maintaining in the lake. And so that's the opportunity of these occasional wet years. Take advantage of them.
Mm-hmm. Candace, would you like to add anything to that? I mean, the Division of Water Resources, I'm sure you're asked all the time, what can we do with this wet year?
Thank you. 167% of normal is where we're at today as far as snowpack, so super excited about that. As you guys are all well aware, we've been in a historic drought long term, and it is going to take more than one good year to get us out of it, just like Paul indicated. And I love the word that you used, and I've been coining this as our opportunity year to get as much water to Great Salt Lake as well as our reservoirs. Our reservoir is about 49% full as well, so we have a lot of deficit to make up from this long-term drought that we've been in.
Mm-hmm. David, the policy assessment that we'll have copies for all of you as we finish today makes really clear that a very large contributing factor is human use. And it's really the only factor that can be changed in the near term. How do we know how much of the current challenge is based on a warming climate, natural variability, which you saw in these slides, and human consumptive uses?
Okay, well, the lake is a really dynamic system, and it's fascinating to study. And Bill outlined some of the answer in the slides, showing the data from the Division of Water Resources that's estimating the depletions running at around 2,000 acre-feet per year. An acre-foot, for those who don't know, is if you take an acre and put a foot of water. So it's a large volume of water. Inflows to the lake have, if you look at the long-term average, they're actually around about 2,000. So that would say that if you didn't have those depletions, you'd be at about 4,000. But if you look at the natural variability over, say, the last 20 years, you've got a reduction of about 400. And if you look at the last 5 years, a reduction of about 600 from that sort of long-term average. That's telling you that the changes with the variability, the current droughts, climate change, are about a third of what we are currently consuming. That's the basis for that, those percentages in the report.
Very good. Bill, I don't know if you want to add anything, but the message I took from it as a non-hydrologist was something along the lines that 2/3 of this challenge is human and natural consumptive use. Am I getting that right?
That's my conclusion as well. I actually see this as incredibly hopeful because it says that we have control of a lot of our future here, and the decisions that we make as a state really have a huge impact on what the future of the Great Salt Lake will be.
Yeah. Brian, I thought you explained really well this target range kind of concept in your opening remarks. Do you want to put any kind of finer point on it? I mean, we had a resolution that was not, passed that picked a single target range. Our reading of this is it's more nuanced. I wanted to give you a chance to comment on that.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Natalie. And yeah, I think that it's complicated. And ultimately, when you look at the amount of water it takes to get back up to, say, a 4198, which was the target level that was discussed, it scares a lot of people, and people said, well, gosh, I'm not sure we're ready to do that. The reality is this. We're seeing ecosystem consequences right now from the lake level where it is currently. If we put more water in that lake, those ecosystem consequences actually, it gets better, right? Situation gets better, it doesn't get worse. And so I guess what we're saying is rather than say, we're recommending this target, we would recommend the state to really consult with that graph from Forestry, Fire, and State Lands and look at those different benefits we get from higher lake elevations. And setting a target goal, I know it's complicated, but that target goal or even a target range is certainly helpful because then we're able to gauge progress towards that rather than just guessing how we're doing. And ultimately, from a policy standpoint, that's a lot more solidified, and it's a lot more easy to gauge on how we're doing. So ultimately, like I said, it really is a choose your own adventure. Every bit of water we get in the lake up to a certain point actually has ecosystem benefits and benefits to people. And if that's the case, we need to figure out how to get more water in the lake, and I'll leave it to the policymakers to set what that acceptable level is, but we all have something to win or lose in this process.
Joel, I'm coming your way. You're a policymaker.
Well, I was.
Yeah. Well, and I think the governor's office still makes policy, but however you want to. I just want you to add in here because it's really the stewardship of state agency professionals, to help implement these policies and.
Sure, and I agree with Brian what he said. I think that there is this range, this healthy range that we need to look at. And we want to have goals, right? It's important that we set goals. What are we trying to accomplish? Why are we making these investments? Is it dust control? Is it the ecosystem that exists out there on salinity? These issues that we're dealing with. And so I think that it's important that as policymakers we do recognize that all these actions that we're taking will make a difference. I really liked the graph that was put up where I say, okay, if the inflows are this, over this much time, this is how we get there. Because then we can start to say, how aggressive are we going to be? What steps are we going to take? We have a myriad of things that we can do. What is the right approach? And that's the debate. How aggressive are we going to be and how much time do we really have? And it's big decisions have to be made. Mm-hmm. So we're working to get these things in place and to really make a difference long term.
How aggressive are we going to be? How much time do we have? Bill, you walked through the climate modeling, and it was complicated, but precip goes up slightly, evaporation goes up a little bit more, temperature goes up a lot. I think the reading is that our task gets more difficult over time.
I think that's the summary, yes,
Yeah.
that it doesn't get easier, and we shouldn't count on more precip to bail us out here. I think that this underscores, one, we need to grapple with this today and tackle this as quickly as we can in the next 5, 10, 20 years. But two, that we need to plan for similar or slightly less water in the coming decades, that we need to look down on this longer horizon and keep that in mind and base these plans on the best science that we have.
Paul, there have been a lot of headlines about Great Salt Lake potentially drying up in 5 years. How serious is the situation? What should people know?
So this situation with the Great Salt Lake is incredibly serious. That's why we're all here. But the headlines saying that the lake may dry in 5 years really caught a lot of people's attention, probably some people here because of those headlines. As part of the strike team, we looked at many different scenarios and started going down there. I mean, we're all sort of geeky, right? We want to play with our numbers and models, and we want to get the right answer. And part of the way down there, we thought we're really asking the wrong question. We didn't come up with a lot of scenarios that could plausibly see us dry in 5 years. But the target elevations point out what we really care about. We care about the dust mitigation. We care about the brine shrimp industry. So the collapse of the Great Salt Lake was the end point in preventing that we've spent most of our time focused on, rather than trying to think about, will it be 5 years, will it be 10 years when the lake is gone? The dire consequences occur way before there. So we've really shifted our focus towards preventing these deleterious effects and restoring the services that we get from the lake.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that the strike team's concern is well before that issue?
Exactly.
Yeah, like we've got issues now and tomorrow and the next day. Any of the other panelists want to add on this point? Go ahead, Brian, and we'll go to others if you want.
I would just say, yeah, I think it's really important to realize that we're facing adverse consequences now, right? And I think that this notion of a ticking time bomb and we've got to do something before it blows up, that may motivate action, but the action probably should be motivated based on the consequences we're seeing today. And the consequences we will see tomorrow into the foreseeable unless we do something different. And I think that's really the motivating factor of why we're all here today, because we see those consequences and we know that we can do better.
Yeah. If we act, the benefits, the values we care about, we can reap, we can have. Joel, anyone else want to add on this point?
Sure, and I would say that those types of, extreme reports are headline grabbing, but what we really want to focus on is the fact that whether the lake goes dry or not, the consequences, as was mentioned, are much dire before that occurs. And so we're trying to work to prevent that from occurring. We care about a healthy, we care about a vibrant lake, and we want that. We want a lake that is supportive of us as people of Utah, right? We have an interaction, we have an impact, and we need to make sure that we recognize that impact and do what we can to offset that rather than going to these extreme scenarios. I can just say this strike team and the report and the things that we're looking at doing, the funding, the policies, I'm very optimistic about where we're going, and I think that there's reason for hope.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, Paul.
I just want to iterate that point. As one of the technical members of the committee, we can do this. It's not going to be easy, but we certainly can prevent the drying of the Great Salt Lake, and way before that, the deleterious effects. I think that's optimistic. It's not going to be easy, but we can do it.
Thank you. The policy assessment includes 11 policy levers or options to help with the lake. I think 7 of them are in conservation. Candace, I come in your way to just ask, are there any of these conservation interventions that you think add, particular promise?
Thanks, Natalie. When I think about it, and it's been discussed here today, and we had lots of discussion within the strike team meetings, is our one arrow in our quiver is changing how we use water and reducing how much water we use. And so I really think it's an all hands on deck approach that we all have to use less water in every sector. We cannot be pitting each other. This water user needs to change and I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, or this water user needs to change. I think we all need to come together as Utahns to address this really critical issue that we're all facing, and I think changing how we use water in the state is at the heart of it, and that's why we saw 7 of them. So I'm not going to pick and choose. I'll say we have to do all the things.
Of them. That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. And Bill, I've heard you say, and we've said it once and maybe underlined it a second time, but maybe we'll do it a third time. I've heard you call committing that conserved water to the lake the linchpin. Tell us your thinking there, because linchpin, is a serious word to use.
Yeah, I think as Brian's presentation really highlighted, it is the foundation for a number of these other conservation actions to succeed. To deliver the benefits and the water to the lake, we really have to be able to carry that out. I don't know, do you want to add, Brian?
I totally agree.
We're all going to learn that term, shepherding water.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that we have seen changes in the state legislature and the state code that make that easier. I think there's also a cultural adaptation that there's a lot of people that don't know how it works, as well as there's maybe some temerity about what does this do to me long term. But ultimately, I think that as people do it more and we're able to shepherd more water to the lake, I think that it'll become much more common, as well as much easier to do.
Yeah. David, you were very forward-looking in your conversations with me about how important conservation was. You wanted to make sure there was a recommendation on conservation included in the report and everything, and I just want to bring your voice into this about why that's so critical.
Right. Well, if we don't get any extra water to the lake, it would continue to go down. I mean, we can calculate that. And that goes into a place that we don't want it to go. So, I mean, we worked out that even if we just want to keep, notwithstanding the occasional wet year like this year, if we want to just keep the lake where it is, which is not necessarily a good place, we should get about 300 acre-feet of extra water each year into the lake. So we've got to find that degree of conservation. If you want to start restoring the lake to better situation, you need to find more conservation. So not really necessarily focusing on where it should come from again, because we've got many options, and we in the task force report, we sort of evaluated whether it should be the different percentages, the trade-offs, whether you get it from ag or municipal industrial or from some of the mineral users. But we need to get more water into the lake.
Yeah. All of you saw the graphic that showed the high agricultural use of water. Joel, you have a lot of background in this area. And Candace references we all have to conserve, but there's a temptation sometimes to say, hey, so much of it's agriculture. We need agriculture to solve the problem because we're just a drop in the bucket. And I think the only real way to address this is to have everybody address it. But I wanted you to speak specifically about what we need from agriculture.
Okay. And I would say that every drop counts, even the small drops. But so when I introduce myself, I go and meet with people, I always say that what do you do? I'm a farmer. That's who I am, farmer, rancher. I love working on the land. I love being part of that life. And it's who I am. And so when we start talking, farmers are the problem, alfalfa is the problem, whatever it may be, again, that's immediately puts people into their corner, and they put up a wall, and they're done. And so in my own business, before I took this job, before I was in the legislature, I recognized personally the importance of conservation. And I installed miles and miles of pipe and laser leveled fields and put in efficiency practices, not because, or partially because I could see that some years I'd have more water than others, and I wanted to make sure that I had stability in my business. And telling that message, like sharing that message, saying, agriculture, yes, you're using a majority of the water, whether here in the Great Salt Lake or just statewide.
But look, let's talk about how you can be just as productive and use less water. When we talk about, I think overall conservation, we had targeted 15%. That's not cutting back production necessarily. That's making investment. The state has, like this year, we're talking about the appropriations committee's going on right now, and I'm here. But that's my commitment to this.
Yes.
But the request was $200 million this year for agriculture optimization. And that's doing cost share with our producers on the ground to help them become more efficient. So there's a commitment there from the legislature, and there's demand there from the industry. When I go and talk to, one of the things that makes me most optimistic about the situation is when I go and talk to a group of farmers and ranchers, they talk about how they want to be part of the solution. They're not fighting us on this. They want to be part of it. It's just, it's really expensive, and they say, well, you know, if we can get some cost share, then we're on board. And these are big investments that will make a big difference. So again, agriculture is part of the solution to this problem.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question. We'll open it up for a few questions from those of you that are in attendance. Brian and Bill, kind of tag team on this one. You co-authored an opinion in the Deseret News this past Sunday. You characterized this situation as both stark and hopeful. I want you to explain that dichotomy. I'll let you guys pick who goes first.
Well, I'll go first because I had a friend approach me yesterday and say, those are going to be the words he's putting on my tombstone. It's dark, but hopeful. The reality is this. We are indeed in a very troubling situation when it comes to the Great Salt Lake. That's the stark portion of this. And we have choices to make as society. We can throw up our arms and say, well, you know, all is lost, or we can get involved and do something different. And what the hopeful portion is this. Yes, realizing that we're in dire times on the lake has to be a motivator for us to actually then take action. And that action to take is not super scary or overwhelming, but rather there are simple changes we could make. And those simple changes that we could make could actually make real benefits on the lake. And doing that consistently, that gives me a lot of hope. It does give me a lot of hope that people can make better choices, we can make better choices as a society, and ultimately save the lake going forward. And Bill, sorry about that.
I agree entirely. I guess it's participating in this effort has made me very hopeful about the future of the Great Salt Lake. It's going to be hard, and it's going to take resolve and urgency and commitment over a long period of time, but it's doable. And I think this is our window of opportunity. This year, next year, the year after matter enormously. But I'm optimistic. I think that, as Brian said, we can do this. We can carry this out.
Very good. Okay, we'd love to take a few questions here. Nick has a microphone that will come your way. Who has a question for our panelists? Okay, here we go. If you mind just introducing yourself as you ask the question.
I'm Lynn DeFreitas, the Executive Director of Friends of Great Salt Lake. And I'd like to thank you all for your work that culminates in this report. I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that you are using the Great Salt Lake Elevation Matrix as a gauge of recognition of elevation as it translates into ecosystem services and ecological viability. And I'd like to credit the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands for the creation of that tool that came out of their 2013 Great Salt Lake Comprehensive Management Plan. So that is kind of, I think, the Rosetta Stone that we can use to go forward. So thank you all, and thank you to Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, another question, please.
Pat Shea, and I'd like each of the panelists, if you're a czar or czarina, how would you spend $1.4 billion to help the lake?
Okay, so asking panelists, let's go really quickly, get down here. You got $1.4 billion, how would you spend it? David?
Agricultural optimization.
Yeah, Paul?
Institute flexibility in agriculture and municipal together.
Yeah, Joel?
Metering, measuring, telemetry, and ag optimization.
Okay, Mr. Bill?
I'd scale up each of these conservation programs tenfold.
Yeah, Brian?
Boy, really? Thank you. Do I have to be different? I would say metering and measuring is really important because ultimately it gives us information and tools. But also I would similarly ramp up these conservation programs and provide a bigger incentive to people to participate.
And, well, since, I'll say this since no one else said it, but they indicated it, is I change how we grow right now. We cannot continue to grow how we're growing. We need to be more water wise. We need to install all the efficiencies within our houses, change out our landscape to be more water wise. Agriculture optimization is a huge one. And I'm a data geek, so I've got to go with telemetry and measuring too, because you can't manage what you don't measure.
Pat, do I get to answer the question too? He says, okay. My economist friends in the audience will appreciate this, but if we price water correctly, we won't have to spend that much. Okay, another question in the back.
So I'm new to this, researching, and I've been talking to different scientists.
Do you mind introducing yourself?
I'm John Meyer, just
Okay.
I would say an independent, concerned citizen.
Great.
Talking to different scientists, I've been hearing a little bit of chatter about the aquifers being drained and lost, and some of that we don't fully know. Is the strike team, are you taking into account the loss of the aquifers and the water going into the lake being diverted to fill the aquifers and not filling the lake? Where does that play into the modeling for this issue?
I think that might be in my wheelhouse. That's a very, very astute question. We're just starting to realize how important the groundwater storage is from what we wouldn't call aquifers, even up in the mountains, all the way down to the aquifers where we get drinking water. We're starting to see some impacts on groundwater. So far, they tend to follow the same trends that we saw on stream flow that Bill showed earlier. So we're not seeing huge fall-offs, but it is an area of concern, and their importance is only being amplified as we start to collect new data, new information about how surface water, groundwater, and the Great Salt Lake are connected, because they are tightly coupled.
Yeah, please, Joe. Yeah.
Really quick, so it is a very astute question. We are seeing isolated, aquifer depletions occurring, right, that we're struggling with. But I'll tell you that this is something that within the state we're taking very seriously. We have budget requests that are going through to look specifically at doing studies on where are aquifers, what are they doing, and what is the interaction between not just the lake, but all surface waters and our aquifers in the state. This isn't just a Great Salt Lake issue, but we're taking this seriously, and we're making big investment to get the correct data so we actually know what's going on. It's really easy to measure a surface reservoir. It's elevation, right? It's much more difficult on the aquifers.
Yeah, very good. And I want to demonstrate this. Ms. Hassenjager, can you respond to this? Did I do okay?
Yeah, you did great. Thank you. I would just add, I think that to all of those things that we need to continue to do research and understanding. I know that there's current ongoing studies to evaluate it, whether it's through the U.S. Geological Survey or the Utah Geological Survey, to analyze and model that groundwater system. I also want to give a big shout out to the Great Salt Lake, I'm going to get it right, Basin Integrated Study, where we are working to coordinate all of the different studies and efforts that are going on. $5 million was appropriated in the last legislative session, and another $3.1 million was given to us through a basin study through the Bureau of Reclamation. So that'll be an ongoing effort that we're looking to integrate all of those efforts.
Thank you. Okay, in the back here, Nick, coming.
Hi, I'm Heather May with the Great Salt Lake Collaborative. I have a question. You guys addressed the tree thinning proposal pretty, you seem to dismiss it as a possible solution, but I'm wondering if you could talk more about that. Should lawmakers be spending their time on that? I know Salt Lake County Council, I think, discussed it last night, and it continues to be a discussion in the legislature. Should it be, based on your analysis?
So I'm going to take a stab at that. I'm not the expert. I'll be very clear about that. And I will say this, having worked in state government, in Joel's job previously, there's a lot of benefits that come from active management of forests, right? And there's a lot of benefits that I think that we should certainly take into consideration absent the water question. There have been proposals proposed in the really over the last month, where they say, listen, if you cut down as many trees as you can, we will have an increased or a concurrent increase in water flow. The science is by far more nuanced on that, and there's been some studies that say, yes, that can happen in certain circumstances, but is by no means a foregone conclusion. And David Down is going to give you the more technical answer, but ultimately it's complicated. And so while there have been instances where we can see that to be the case, I would not go to the bank to say that's the way.
Right, so just elaborating a bit on that. It's probably worth acknowledging that the roots of this suggestion come from sort of older research on clear cutting that did show increases in stream flow. But if you look at the sort of comprehensive literature, or even look at about 150 watersheds, as a student working with me did, some places you find increases in stream flow, some places you find decreases in stream flow, and it tended to be arid areas where there was decrease in stream flow. And the complications are because whenever trees get disturbed, thinned, there's fires, you get regrowth of new vegetation that uses more water, and those sort of effects that make it an uncertain, it's uncertain what's going to actually happen, and you might actually end up reducing the stream flow through forest actions.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, sounds like Bill.
I would summarize, I think our conclusion is the water benefits are likely small and uncertain. They could be null or slightly negative, but there are so many benefits to managing forests actively and proactively around wildfires, ecosystem services, so we should consider that.
And even water quality, right? So to prevent against catastrophic burns, which then may have a huge impact on water quality. But in terms of water quantity, the data is by far less certain.
Let's do one more question. Let's go way at the back here. Oh, okay, we'll do both. We'll do two more.
Hi, Chandler Rosenberg with Save Our Great Salt Lake. I'm curious to hear where we are with the water banking program, as well as HB 33 and HB 410. Have farmers started to lease their water, or where are we? What does the timeline look like for those programs?
Everyone's looking at you, Joe.
You want me to answer that? Okay, I will. Who's the sponsor of 33 again? I can't remember.
It was a fantastic piece of legislation, that's all I know. Okay, let me start. HB 410, so this was what established the Water Trust. And so the trust has been organized and formed. Board members or the oversight committee has been established, so their obligation now is to create bylaws and rules. Money has been transferred to them, so we're on the brink of starting to do some transactions. There's been a lot of interest there, and so it's an independent entity with some state oversight. We look at the projects or the proposals that are coming forward, and we'll start to see transaction occurring. One thing about that I've had to learn being in state government is things do move slowly. We're going as quick as we can, but we've got to do things right as well. In-stream flows, that legislation passed last year, that was HB 33. We're looking at, there have been a few applications. This is, again, that component of being able to shepherd water down to Great Salt Lake. So it's somewhat in conjunction with 410. Once we have a block of water that we can move, then we'll start moving it. It's somewhat cyclical in that, we're out of irrigation season now, so there's not a lot of water right now that can be leased. It'll be this upcoming growing season. So we're looking at some pretty significant moves. I mean, thousands and thousands of acre feet that we're looking at adding to inflows to the Great Salt Lake from those pieces of legislation. There was another component, water banking. Also, water banking is a much broader tool. More of a broader approach, not necessarily the scalpel that sometimes we need. Again, there's been several different applications in different parts of the state, and we're looking at that. Part of this is in some of these areas, we've got to have blocks of water that are freed up, right? So these investments that we've made in ag optimization or within our cities on turf buyback programs, other things, those investments just took effect July 1 of this last year. So they've got to be implemented, then we've got to measure the water, calculate the data. Again, that's that slowness we have. It's cyclical, it's seasonal. But I can tell you that things in the works now are going to make huge differences in the next 1, 2, 3 years. We're going to see significant change in the near future.
That's very good. Okay, last question right back here. Doug Wilkes.
Hi, just, is the task force done now? Is there a next step? Do you continue?
We disbanded.
I'll take a stab at that. No. I think there's a lot of...
Do you need $1.2 billion to continue?
There are so many benefits from this process. We would very much like to continue in this work. And ultimately, I think that it's been rewarding, as I said at the outset, but ultimately, there's a lot more work to do in analyzing the policy alternatives that we have before us, as well as helping implement some of the policy options we have, right? And those things I think are very important and meaningful. So it's something we hope to continue on.
And Doug, I'll add, I know it's the leadership of our university, the University of Utah, that wants to keep being involved in this process. I believe that Brian can speak for Utah State in that regard.
Absolutely.
Joel, as a state agency, you can speak there.
I think this has been very fruitful and productive and beneficial.
One of our recommendations is that the state now prioritize these policy options, and you need more detail to do that, and we could help with that detail. So, okay, the last thing I'd like to do, and Candace, I'm going to start with you out in fairness, but I'm just ask you to give one word of advice to state leaders to return the Great Salt Lake to healthy elevation levels. Just a word of advice, and then we'll work this way.
I guess I'll go with everything. We have to do all the things to use that arrow in our quiver, reduce how much water we're using, in all of those ways.
All of the above, okay.
How do you follow everything? Geez.
Trying to trip you up.
I would say investment in conservation matters and will continue to matter over the long time horizon. And so let's not say that we have arrived because we have one wet year. In reality, we're going to have to be in this process for the long haul.
Yeah. Bill?
I guess my word would be monitor. We need to monitor and model and check in and really base our decisions on the best science that we have. And this is iterative. We've got to do it over time to see how well are we doing and where are we aiming to be on these lake levels.
Joe?
I would say it's funding for our department. It's being able to implement all these wonderful ideas and these things that come out of the strike team, but just we have structure, we need to be able to implement it, and that implementation means appropriation, means funding.
They took all the good ones, so I'll go with research. As a research scientist, as we get more data, as we get more monitoring, as we get a broader understanding of how people and climate change in the Great Salt Lake coexist, we need some support to help make sense of that beyond what the state agencies can do, because they're pretty constrained. They're with day-to-day tasks in terms of if we give them a whole bunch more data, you know, they need some help in being able to have the staff or the resources to make sense of it.
That's great. David Tarbotton, who leads the State Water Lab, gets the last word.
So I would say recognize that it's going to be hard, commit to our values that we see as a state and the values of the lake, and that means commit the money, commit the research, commit the conservation to get it all done.
Let's give our panelists a hand. I want to just mention in closing, you know, as a university, a public university, we have a three-part mission: to teach, to do research, and to serve. And this effort was motivated by the last of those, to serve this state, and brought together the research universities that do about 95% of the R&D research for this state, bring them together and join with our partners in service in state agencies to tackle a really difficult issue. It's been a real rewarding experience, and we want to continue. I want to mention to all of you that we have copies of our policy assessment at the back as you leave. I want to also mention that we'd like the strike team to take a quick photograph as we finish here on stage, so please join us up front. And then lastly, our next Newsmaker Breakfast will be March 15th. We'll be discussing the timely topic of federal and state debt policy. How do you like the versatility of the Gardner Institute? Please write us at gardnerinstitute@eccles.utah.edu if you have comments, and please follow our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram for our latest updates. Thank you so much for being here.